Previously, she was a Research and Innovation Attaché for the Quebec Government Office in Boston, where Patricia facilitated research and technology partnerships between Quebec and the United States. She also served as the co-chair of the Science and Technology Diplomatic Circle in Boston, an organization of 67 countries with international offices in the Boston region. Today's event and the research paper are made possible by the Korea Foundation. I want to especially thank Director Lee and Amy Chu for their help and who were with us every step of the way in putting together today's event and research paper together. And once again, I want to thank you for being here this afternoon. I'll turn the mic over to Patricia.
So hello everyone, and thank you for joining us here today in beautiful Los Angeles. I'd like to thank the Korea Foundation for making this discussion and the report possible, and the panelists for making their participation in this panel. We're lucky enough to have three fantastic panelists today. First, we have Martin Rauchbauer, the former tech ambassador from Austria and senior tech diplomacy fellow with the Diplo Foundation and a fellow at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles. We also have Jaehoon Chung, who leads the Office of Science, ICT, and Economic Affairs at the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in San Francisco. He also leads the Northern California Korean Business Forum and serves as a secretary for the Association of Korean Government Agencies in Silicon Valley. And finally, we have Eva Pereira, Chief Data Officer for the City of Los Angeles, where she leads a team focused on improving data governance and data services. Her team has delivered award-winning data projects on topics like racial equity, digital inclusion, the pandemic recovery, and more. I wanted to give some context on the current state of tech diplomacy in the US and the Republic of Korea before we get started with our panelists. Over the years, we have seen tech companies grow in influence. The social media platforms of the 2010s have now morphed into prominent players in domestic and international politics. Meta has been implicated in the genocide in Myanmar. Twitter has become the de facto public square and is a key piece of what we would call digital diplomacy, or diplomacy that is carried out on the web. We've also seen the first non-US entity take its place among the US tech giants. TikTok went from a dancing platform to a key source of information and sometimes disinformation in the Russian aggression against Ukraine. In addition to social media platforms, we've seen companies like Amazon and Microsoft implicated in geopolitics, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity. Early on, some countries recognized the power that these tech companies have on their internal politics and decided to appoint diplomats to engage with them as if they were nation states. In 2017, the first tech ambassador was appointed to Silicon Valley from Denmark. Kasper Kling was Denmark's first tech ambassador and was posted to engage in three major areas: tech for democracy, responsibility and technology development, and cybersecurity. Since then, the landscape has evolved with the appointment of more tech diplomats, mainly from Europe, but recently the first tech diplomat from Brazil was appointed, and others are developing their capabilities in this space. In addition to engaging with the tech companies, tech diplomats engage with each other and civil society through platforms such as the Freedom Online Coalition, Silicon Valley Working Group, and the Tech Diplomacy Playground. The Freedom Online Coalition in Silicon Valley focuses on bringing an international affairs perspective on human rights, raising awareness about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, learning about how frontier technologies might threaten human rights online, improving literacy for Silicon Valley and the FOC governments on human rights-centered tech policy issues, and highlighting activities in the human rights field, improving information flows and transparency between big tech in Silicon Valley and home governments as well as the multilateral community, and sharing best practices on how to effectively engage with the global technology sector on FOC issues. There are about 35 countries that are part of the Freedom Online Coalition, but unfortunately Korea is currently not part of this organization at the moment. And the other initiative which I talked about is the Tech Diplomacy Playground, which brings together like-minded tech diplomats in Silicon Valley to discuss best tech diplomacy practices and engage with the private sector, and this is open to all countries. And Jaehoon recently joined that initiative. So Korea has a large presence in Silicon Valley and is focused primarily on increasing trade and investment with Silicon Valley, promoting Korean startups and helping Korean startups access the US market, promoting Korea as a partner for science and technology projects, and increasing the ability of Korean leadership in sectors such as clean tech and information and communications technology. Korea's engagement with big tech is much different when it comes to how the country regulates these tech giants. Korea is actually a world leader in the space, having enacted the first antitrust law against Alphabet and Apple for their in-app payment self-preferencing systems, as well as the first case of enacting privacy law against an artificial intelligence system, in this case, a chatbot. And lastly, I think most democratic governments are concerned about the rise of digital authoritarianism and concerned about how to protect digital human rights, which is why more democratic countries are appointing tech diplomats to Silicon Valley to have these discussions with its decision makers. I think one of the ways we can do this is to incorporate more technologists into government who understand these issues and can help create policies to tackle issues such as digital human rights. It's imperative that the gap between technologists and policymakers is decreased to ensure that we are not only making technology work for democracy, but also not stifling innovation. So the first question I have for the panelists, I'm going to start with Martin, because he has been part of the tech diplomacy ecosystem for quite some time now. So my question to you, Martin, is how would you say the tech diplomacy ecosystem has evolved since the appointment of the first tech ambassador from Denmark in 2017?
Well, thank you, Patricia, and also congratulations for your really excellent report, which is really an important element in a process that is happening in the last years, and that is that this emerging field of tech diplomacy that is mainly happening in the Bay Area and in Silicon Valley is becoming more aware of what it is actually doing and trying to define also the terms. And I think your paper is a very, very important contribution to this. To your question regarding a little bit the development of tech diplomacy over the last years, maybe I start a little bit with my own story, which is I think quite symptomatic of also some of the deficiencies that nation states face. So in 2015, our then foreign minister, Sebastian Kurz, who then became the prime minister of Austria, went on a typical Silicon Valley innovation tour, accompanied with journalists from Austria, visited the big tech companies, where many pictures, in front of Facebook and Google, and he said that we need to be present here. This is the Austrian Foreign Ministry needs to establish an official presence in Silicon Valley in order to serve Austrian startups, because there were increasingly companies that set up office there, but they were lacking coordination, they were lacking support. And he announced this, and then the Foreign Ministry needed to implement this, and they didn't really know how to implement it at the time, because we lacked a kind of a government structure, a government vision, a government strategy. And basically, when I was sent there to open up our office in 2016, the focus was really very much on startups, on innovation. It was an innovation office, very much like many other countries have. And then over time, I think the mood kind of changed. If you think of the year 2018 was the year of the Cambridge Analytica scandal that broke out. And the mood changed in Europe, it changed in the United States, and it even changed in Silicon Valley. And what I think was important for tech diplomacy was that the relationship with governments, which was at the beginning of Silicon Valley one of distance, and of self-governance. So in Silicon Valley, entrepreneurs thought that the best thing governments could do was to stay away and to not interfere, because it would hinder innovation. Regulation was anathema to many of the startups that would then become global platforms. But I think some of the issues that already arose in 2017, 2018 had not only impacts on governments and on our societies, but it also had impacts on the tech companies themselves that came increasingly under scrutiny, under difficulties, understanding and explaining its own policies. When it came particularly to the issue of privacy, many of these tech companies were facing increasing scrutiny, and in 2018, one of the first big legislations that came out of Europe was the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that entered into force in May 2018. And there was, of course, it was a European regulation, but it was set up in such a way that basically it had global implications. It meant that also companies that in some ways had a European connection, whether they were affecting European customers even outside of the European Union, were affected. And so there was a real demand to understand the implications, and they came to us, the representations of the European countries. And also there was this question of, well, are there going to be US or even California privacy regulations that would ensue, and how would they relate to this GDPR regulation? And would now companies be faced with a patchwork, a global patchwork of privacy regulations, and would they have to kind of orient themselves in an increasing way? So that was one of the starting points for us, and we organized a lot of spontaneous roundtable talks where we invited people from the Commission to explain, and even had talks with proponents of civil society. As you know, the California Consumer and Privacy Act followed suit and had many aspects that were similar or parallel, and was even thinking at the time of how to reach some sort of adequacy with the European regulation. So that was, I think, the big issue of privacy was one of the turning points for many European countries, because it was not that we wanted something from the tech companies came to us. Another one was, I think for me, a key moment when the European Union decided to enforce a new regulation on intellectual property and copyright, the Copyright Directive in the European Union, and all of a sudden there were the executives of YouTube coming to me and said, well, we are heavily affected with that, and we can't really get through to your government. And at the time, Austria was holding the presidency of the European Union. Please, could you help us? We need to talk. There have to be conversations about this. But it was not just YouTube and the global platform, it was also civil society organizations who were saying, actually, you're, with this regulation and certain articles, you are actually impeding free speech. So that was something, I think, that European Union officials were not really aware of. And so what really developed was a kind of very spontaneous set of talks, roundtables, discussions, facilitating initiatives where European countries were spontaneously involved. And then I think following from that was an increasingly awareness that these domestic debates about human rights issues like privacy, like surveillance, that they also had an international component. You mentioned Myanmar, but there were numerous other occasions where domestic legislation or domestic concerns had global implications. And I think that is another aspect of tech diplomacy that evolved over the last years, that we cannot only see, since technology is global and those platforms are global players, we cannot only see them from a domestic or even a local perspective. We need to see them from a global perspective, because whatever we do, it has implications, sometimes unintended consequences, sometimes opposite consequences of our original intentions. So the Freedom Online Coalition that you mentioned at the beginning really was an attempt to have these kinds of conversations, and is increasingly used as a platform by the big players to get these kind of unintended consequences to our diplomatic channels. And maybe last but not least, why do you need diplomats, and what can diplomats add to these kind of conversations? Because you always had, with technology companies, once they reached a certain scale, you always had, of course, policy teams and government affairs teams or lobbyists that would be strategically positioned in the centers of decision making in Washington, D.C., in Brussels, and capitals around the world, in Asia, and that were trying to influence and shape upcoming legislation and regulation. So why do you now have government representation in the centers of power and the decision-making centers in Silicon Valley, or in where the headquarters are, on the US West Coast? There are a lot of companies, of course, that have their headquarters here in Los Angeles, or in Seattle, or in other important innovation ecosystems in the United States or in other countries. And of course, the idea there is that you have different kinds of conversations when you talk on an executive level. I would say, yes, a lot of things have changed, and a lot of these processes that you mentioned have now started. But there are also a lot of challenges that remain to get to the level of meaningful conversations. I think governments also need to improve a lot. They need to, in some ways, equip diplomats with competence and knowledge to actually have meaningful conversations and not just engage in generalities. And also, of course, the tech companies need to understand what diplomacy really is. It's not a PR exercise, it's not a marketing exercise. It is a meaningful conversation among equal partners. And you need to also manage real conversations behind closed doors, create often this effect of intransparency, and how is civil society involved or not involved. So you need to manage that as well. You need to be transparent to the maximum amount possible, and involve all the important players. And I think those things are still in the making, but I think that the Bay Area is a very interesting laboratory for this tech diplomacy, and it's increasingly spreading to other areas of international diplomacy. Of course, in the multilateral system, places like New York, where the United Nations are situated, they have processes, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity, which involve the private sector. Geneva, seat where a lot of standards and international norms are created, are very important. And I think companies, for example, like Microsoft, realize that they need to be present there and have meaningful conversations with the countries. So I think we are still in a process when it comes to tech diplomacy that is evolving, but I think it is now very clear to all stakeholders that we are living in a time of change, and I think there are certain moments like January 6th here at storming the Capitol, where it was very clear that social media had an outsized influence on our democracies. It was a wake-up call, I think, for many, many countries. The Ukraine war, war in Ukraine, the start of Ukraine, I think, was a wake-up call, and for the role also that technology plays in this. And I think there will be more of those events, more of those really defining shifts and events happening in the future. And what is not yet in place is kind of a structural approach to those things. It's still very much happening haphazardly and in a spontaneous fashion.
Thanks, Martin. I think we hear a lot about how Europe is altering the tech regulatory landscape and how they're, engaging with big tech. Like, there's a very large amount of European tech diplomats in Silicon Valley. Obviously, Martin, you mentioned how GDPR has kind of changed things and had some of the tech companies coming to you. And I'm sure that with the forthcoming Digital Markets Act and the Digital Service Act, that will continue. But what we don't hear a lot about is what Korea is doing in this space. So, Jaehoon, could you talk a little bit about the Republic of Korea's approach to engaging with big tech?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this important event. I'm very happy to attend this event. I am a Korean Consulate in San Francisco. I'm dealing with science-related projects, and my main job is to promote the Korean startups to expand to the US market, especially the Silicon Valley. And so when I'm dealing with this kind of things, I like to share my experience about this kind of discussions about the tech diplomacy. At the beginning of this year, I got a phone call from the director of the Information Technology Powers Department from the Ministry of Science, which is my ministry. I dispatched it from the Ministry of Science and ICT, and he asked me to deliver the Korean government concerns to the Apple, Meta, not Google at this case, is that the Korean government sent the survey questionnaire to the Meta and the Apple Korean offices, but the Korean offices of the global big tech did not answer the question about the status of the business in Korean market, saying that the headquarters in Silicon Valley do not approve their answers to the questions of the Korean government. So the Korean government directly asked me to contact to the headquarters in Silicon Valley and deliver the Korean government's concerns about that. So I tried to contact the Apple, especially Apple, and I tried to contact the Korean employees in Apple and try to get the contact point of this kind of things. And also I tried to contact the Korean Innovation Center, which is located in the near Apple headquarters, and they have some relationship with them. But the Apple did not answer to my request. So it's very difficult to meet the senior level officials in Apple. So that's why I have interested in this kind of issue, the tech diplomacy, tech diplomat. So as you asked, the Korean is the first country to introduce kind of the Google law, Google Act, which is the Telecommunication Business Act. We kind of require any companies, including Google, to provide the alternative options, payment options, so the application developers can is able to choose the alternative options by the making law. But the problem is that actually the Google provide 2 options, not 3 options. Google provide their own in-house payment option to pay not buy the digital goods services, or Google provide another option through the third party, and then they have to use their Google's payment system. But they did not provide another option, which is outlinking option, which is the app developer can sidestep the paying the kind of sales the code piece to the Google. So the Google contend that they provide the alternative option. So they do not have they deal with the responsibility. So, but the application, but the Korea regulatory government think that it is not abide by the Korean law. So there's a kind of the lawsuit between them right now. So in this kind of things, I feel like the Korean discussion about the tech diplomacy is focused on the regulation between the Korean government and the tech giant. It's a bilateral conversation, and also the Korean the discussion about the tech giant, about the tech diplomacy is about for the promote the Korean startups or the Korean economies, something like that. So we still do not focus on the other kind of the democratic values or something like that, multilateral discourse for the participation in international the community about, for example, to make the internet more secure and more free and more open, something like that. Right now, because we still have I think as Martin said, the Korean Assembly members also visited the Silicon Valley in 2019, and the delegation of the Korean National Assembly members also visited the Denmark, the Innovation Center Denmark, and they are very inspired by their visit, and then they try to make a law to introduce the position of the tech diplomat into the organization of the Korean government. But not now. It's not the task by the Congress right now. So anyway, so what I want to mention is that the Korea discussion about the tech diplomacy is very related to the kind of the promoting the Korean startup ecosystems and right now. Yeah, I think I feel like that right now. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Building upon something that Martin said earlier, about diplomats gaining competences in technology. I'd like to direct the next question to Eva. Why is it important to have technologists working in government, and how does that affect policy?
Can you hear me? Yes. That's a great question. I think it's really important to have people who are very familiar with the latest developments in technology advising Congress, advising our regulatory bodies. not to be ageist, but the average age of Congress is 58. The average age of the Senate is 65. So, you know, there's a real issue with, I think a lot of the times, people who are in regulatory positions maybe not being well versed in the technologies that they are meant to regulate, and a lot of that work falls oftentimes on their staff. So, you know, I guess prior to joining the city during grad school, I interned at the White House during the Obama administration with OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and they were very much focused at the time on building technology expertise within government and building out the civic tech ecosystem. So at the time, they were launching something called 18F, which is a digital services agency within the federal government. They've also launched USDS, the US Digital Service, which is another technology and digital services agency within the federal government. And since then, you've seen lots of, I guess, nonprofit organizations proliferate. So there's a really great organization called Coding It Forward that recruits technologists to work in city, state, and federal government. And I think that brings much needed expertise to government, and also builds a pipeline of talent that would otherwise be gobbled up by Facebook or Meta, Twitter, Snapchat, etc. And there's another organization called Tech Congress that I wanted to call attention to because they are bringing technologists into congressional staffing positions. So I think that's very important when it comes to improving regulation and making sure that members of Congress have a better grasp of regulation. So that organization typically provides 1 to 2 year fellowships where folks can, you know, leave their day job and come consult on the Hill and improve our policy, which is very much needed. And then finally, there's another organization that was just launched called US Digital Corps that is also embedding technologists within the federal government at this time. So there are lots of initiatives at play. It's definitely, I think, moving in the right direction, but not quick enough. And there is a real need for just a better grasp of the issues.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask the next question of Martin. So something I think that you kind of mentioned earlier is about measuring impact in tech diplomacy. And you know, diplomacy itself is very difficult to measure. How do you measure influence? So as the tech ambassador from Austria, how did you measure success? And since tech diplomacy has evolved, you know, since 2017, how would you measure success now?
I think, as you mentioned, it's incredibly difficult to measure, but I would say the small area that I could kind of oversee over the last 5 years has seen a dramatic increase in governments investing in tech diplomacy and in tech diplomats. So you have now, instead of traditional consular generals that were mainly focusing on their citizens and on consular activities, you now have almost in every country that is represented in Silicon Valley and in the Bay Area, you have now policy teams, policy officers, and of course you have the heads of the office that are either carry the title tech ambassador or tech envoy, and they are often not career diplomats. If you think of the British Consul General, he is actually an entrepreneur, or the Canadian Consul General, so he's not a career diplomat, so he brings this expertise from the private sector to government. The European Union, for the first time, I think, in its own diplomatic history, it has a foreign service also since a number of years, and it usually has its so-called EU delegations in capital cities, in centers of political powers, and this September 1st, it's opening in Silicon Valley an office with a EU diplomat from the Commission in Brussels heading it. So I think just the proliferation of tech diplomats and countries developing capacity, I think is a sign that it is considered important, and in fact I'm writing on a report of the Diplo Foundation in Geneva, trying to measure that change, that really sea change since about 2017. And it's going to be published in the fall. Otherwise, I would say what is also a good yardstick, a good way of measuring it is in terms of the kind of conversations that are not initiated by tech diplomats but by the private sector itself. And they're initiated not in Brussels or in Seoul or in DC, but they're initiated in the diplomatic representations. I think if you have, which kind of gives also evidence of an awareness in the companies that it actually provides added value, tech diplomacy. I would still say that there are many challenges. What you said about Korea, I think, is still true for almost all countries, in that we also are competitors amongst each other, and we of course see tech diplomacy also as a way to promote our own economies, our own interests, as diplomacy always was. And the question really is, how do we cooperate as countries? How do we work together? And I think there the question is who cooperates and who works together, and there you need in some ways an agreement on values. You need to be in some ways like-minded. You need to have more or less the same goals. There will be always differences, even among friends, and if I just think of my own experience, the transatlantic relationship between Europe and the United States, there are sometimes differences on how we even see such fundamental things as freedom of speech and other basic rights. But ultimately, countries that have more or less the same North Star can work together, and it's more effective, it's more efficient, and it's more effective in getting our own citizens' agenda to the right places. And I personally think the real impact can only be measured once we have tech diplomacy leave this kind of laboratory phase it is still in now, and once there are processes in place, which have always been a hallmark of diplomacy. That it becomes kind of an institutionalized affair, and not so much dependent on personal initiative, on who knows whom, which is still, I think, defining tech diplomacy at the moment. But once you have processes in place, not only in Silicon Valley, but also in our headquarters, I think then it will be much easier to measure our impact.
Thanks. And as we kind of mentioned throughout this discussion, some of these issues that tech diplomats push are technology for democracy and tech for human rights. So Ava, could you tell us how the work that you've done with the City of Los Angeles has promoted tech for democracy or tech for human rights?
Sure. We're not a national level regulatory body like the other folks on the stage, but we do work a lot with data, and we work with data in the public interest. So a lot of our work focuses around 3 core tenets, so promoting data access, data culture, and data literacy throughout Los Angeles. And so to that end, we do a lot of community engagement work surrounding our open data program. So for example, we recently had a digital literacy workshop training series with our neighborhood council system here in Los Angeles. So that's the closest layer of government to the people. There are 99 neighborhood councils in LA, and as you know, we're very geographically dispersed. And so we did some workshops with them to make sure that they understood how to leverage our open data and pull out insights that they need for their advocacy efforts at the local level. So that's one way at a very local level where we're helping folks through data to tell their story, communicate their needs better, and advocate better. And then beyond that, I mean, we use our open data to partner with organizations throughout the city and county around specific issues. So during the pandemic, we had a hackathon focused on food insecurity. So we partnered with LA County, we partnered with the USC Keck School of Medicine, and basically had gotten new data. It was a Census Pulse survey data around rising food insecurity during the pandemic, and used that to really brainstorm ways to provide better services to residents. We've also held hackathons with NASA around air quality, so strategizing ways to improve air quality, and my team in particular is looking at where to deploy air quality meters where we have gaps throughout the city. So, you know, I think not tech regulation that the other folks on the stage are dealing with, but I guess more immediate on the ground support for communities and their needs.
Well, I think, you know, these discussions that we're having at like the international level or the bilateral level, we hope that they trickle down to the local level, obviously. So it's, you know, it's interesting to hear the local, like, city perspective of how, you know, cities like the city of Los Angeles are dealing with like tech for democracy and tech for human rights. So thank you for that perspective. Jaehoon, I want to ask, you know, you said what you're focusing on now with Korean tech diplomacy is really on the promotion of startups and helping Korean startups, you know, come to the US and explore the market here. How do you see the future of Korean tech diplomacy? Do you think the consulate will be engaging more with big tech in Silicon Valley and joining some of these initiatives that the other consulates and government offices in San Francisco are part of?
Yeah, definitely I can say yes. We will engage more and more because I think there's two reasons. The first thing is that the Korean, for example, the Korea Communications Commission, which is responsible for regulating content providers and the telecommunication service providers, like Google and the other, for example, SK Broadband, something like that, and is under increasing pressure to intervene in the tech giants' internal policies, whatever it is it is kind of algorithm decision or just policy to the access to their data, something like that. So the Korean government will demand more and more the directly contacting in contact with the tech giant. And also another reason is that we also kind of pressure from the international community. Actually we are the first country from the recipient of ODA, overseas assistance, to the donor country, donor of ODA country. It's first and the only country. So I think that underdeveloped or the developing countries expect the Korea to assist them with kind of the technical or financial solution to digital divide, something like that. And also the advanced or the developed countries also push us to join the international discussion or the dialogue or initiatives. Like I said, the kind of the internet more safer and interoperable or open internet kind of thing. So in this situations, Korean is more and more push and more and more put the more resources to this kind of the discussion. Actually recently the newly elected Korean government is emphasizing on the kind of the economy and the national interest, the national security. We come to see the economy from the point of view of the national security. So when the President Biden and President Yoon Suk-yeol met in Seoul, and at that time the President Yoon said that the economy is the security and security is economy. So the Korean government will participate kind of in such a more the international discussions about the kind of the securing the supply chain, global supply chain, or some other kind of democratic value discussions. So I feel like the Korean government will push forward this kind of the action. So I feel like I think it can be the more resources, and there can be more the staffing, or even it is not the tech deployment or not. So in that kind of point of view, that I can say yes to. Yeah.
Great, thanks. So now I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience, if there are any, for our panelists.
I have a comment and question. From what I learned from the panel discussion, I tend to think that maybe the main task of tech diplomacy is to set up a kind of global norm which can be applied to every player or every company, and so that the companies they can work they can function under the same rules, under the same conditions. And I'm a Korean diplomat. I'm working at the Korean Consulate in Los Angeles. When I worked in the UK, I recall that there was a debate between the US and European countries about GDPR, and there was a difference between the two continents. And I was wondering where the discussion is now standing.
So on that last bit, there are now institutionalized conversations between the European Union and the United States under the new, under the current US Biden administration. There's been trade and technology councils that meet on a regular basis and discuss existing as well as upcoming regulations, and some of them were mentioned: the Digital Market Act, the Digital Services Act. There's also an AI Act in the making in Brussels, and this of course affects the United States on a federal level, but sometimes it's very difficult in the United States to enact federal legislation concerning technology, and therefore it's also important to keep in mind the important role of states, like the state of California, that has come up with important legislation, as well as other states and regional entities as well. But to your first part of the question, whether to establish a global norm regarding tech diplomacy, I think that's a very interesting point. because of course tech companies are not nation states. They are not. They don't have the legitimacy of a nation state. They're not elected or in any way, and they also don't have the same motivation, the same incentive structures as nation states. Ultimately, they have a business model and they need to make money, and that's why they're in business. And therefore, they are not kind of equal partners by their very nature. So, how do you have, in some ways, how do you structure such a dialogue? And I think it's an important point about tech diplomacy, but it's an important point about I would say global planetary issues in general, like climate change. We need to find new ways of addressing these challenges that affect us globally, and where we can only find global answers, and where clearly the companies and the platforms need to play a role, because they play a role, and they need to also play a role in solving the issues, and they want to also. And how to establish that, I think tech diplomacy is an aspect of it. But I still think that even for governments, it's sometimes hard to grasp this concept of tech companies acting like nation states. They are not nation states. They're not politically legitimized, and there will always be this kind of tension. On the other hand, I think what we've learned in recent years is that the nation state is not dead. We still need nation states, and they sometimes, in the good and in the bad, show that they are still to be counted with. And I think this reality also means that we need to invest in the nation states and in government capacities in order to equip them with. In order to equip them so that we can face these global challenges.
And I think I would just also mention that, with the global norms and standards for tech diplomacy, with the appointment of the Brazilian tech diplomat, some of the discussions I had with him were about, how their tech diplomacy strategy is very different from the European model of tech diplomacy. And I'm sure, if Korea appoints a tech diplomat to Silicon Valley, that will be different from the European model as well. So I think we'll see that change depending on which countries enter the Silicon Valley diplomatic ecosystem.
Hi, just to build upon that last comment and questions. We've seen from a lot of the bigger tech companies changes coming from within that